My name is Winifred Prescott, and I am 34 years old. Yesterday afternoon, I sat in a leather wingback chair in my grandfather's house in Concord, Massachusetts, and listened to my mother tell 30 of our relatives that I was a thief. She stood by the unlit hearth wearing black cashmere and an expression of practiced grief. In her left hand, she gripped a stack of printed bank statements. She did not yell. In our family, raising your voice means losing the argument. She spoke with precise, careful diction. She looked at my aunts, my uncles, and my cousins, and announced that I had siphoned $140,000 from my grandfather Theodore over the last 2 years of his life. She expected me to cry. She expected me to beg for forgiveness or scream in denial. She wanted a public breakdown to validate her lie. But here is what Sylvia did not know. My grandfather's private accountant had been auditing every single transaction in that house for a decade, and he was currently parked at the end of the driveway waiting for my signal. Before I tell you what happened when that accountant walked through the front door, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Orange Vengeance. It helps the channel grow more than you know. And while you are here, drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from today. I always read the comments. Now let me take you back to that living room. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked, marking the seconds. 30 people stared at me. In a state that prides itself on intellectual rigor and academic prestige, a public accusation of financial abuse is a death sentence. These were not people who threw tantrums. They were deans and surgeons who destroyed reputations with quiet, measured sentences. My uncle shook his head. A cousin I had not seen since college refused to meet my eyes. They had already convicted me. I did not look at them. I looked at my phone resting in my lap. I am a biostatistician. I build data models for clinical trials. On my screen, I was reviewing a scatter plot for a phase 3 study. The p-value for the control group showed an anomaly. It was statistically significant, but mathematically flawed. Someone had manipulated the variables to fit a predetermined conclusion, just like my mother was doing right now. Sylvia stepped closer to me. The floorboards groaned under her heels. "We expected greed from strangers, Winifred," she said, "but not from our own blood. Your grandfather died believing his estate was secure, and you took that from him." "Well," Sylvia prompted. Her voice tightened. Her composure was fracturing at the edges because I was not giving her the reaction she required. "Have you nothing to say for yourself?" I locked my phone. The screen went dark. I slipped the device into my pocket and stood up. The leather chair sighed as the weight lifted. I smoothed the wrinkles from my charcoal trousers. I picked up my navy wool peacoat from the side table and slid my arms into the sleeves. I fastened the buttons starting from the bottom and working my way up to the collar. 1, 2, 3, 4. Every eye in the room tracked my hands. I looked at Sylvia. I looked at the printed papers trembling slightly in her grip. As a statistician, I do not argue with fabricated data. I just wait for the audit. Without a single word, I turned and walked toward the foyer. Winifred, Sylvia called out. Her voice cracked, rising half an octave. "Do not walk away from this. If you walk out that door, you are finished in this family." I grasped the brass handle of the front door, pressed the latch, and pulled. The December wind off the Concord River hit my face. I stepped over the threshold and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The latch clicked into place, cutting off her voice, severing the accusation, and leaving my mother alone with an audience she could no longer control. I sat in my car at the end of the circular driveway. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as I shifted into park, but I did not turn off the engine. The heater blew warm air against my hands. Through the windshield, I watched the warm yellow light spilling from the windows of my grandfather's house. Shadows moved across the drawn curtains. My relatives were inside, likely congratulating my mother on her performance. I leaned back against the headrest and calculated the exact timeline of her deception. To comprehend the event that just transpired in that living room, you have to understand the fundamental equation my mother used to run our family. In Sylvia's mind, resources were never allocated based on necessity or merit. They were distributed according to a rigid hierarchy of inherited prestige. My older brother Carter occupied the absolute apex of that hierarchy. Carter is the quintessential Massachusetts golden child. He possesses the specific brand of effortless charm that thrives at regatta tailgates and faculty mixers. For the past 8 years, he has been pursuing a doctorate in European history at a private university in Boston. The actual focus of his dissertation changes every 3 semesters. He has never published an academic paper. He has never taught a seminar. He spends his days attending lectures and his evenings cultivating relationships with people he deems important. Carter lived a life entirely insulated from consequence. Sylvia funded his existence with relentless devotion. She paid the rent on his spacious 2-bedroom apartment in Cambridge. She covered the monthly lease on his silver Audi. She financed his weekly networking dinners at high-end steakhouses where he supposedly courted potential advisors over oysters and expensive scotch. I represented the control group in this family experiment. When I turned 18, Sylvia informed me that higher education was a significant financial investment and her portfolio was already dedicated to Carter's academic trajectory. She offered me nothing. I accepted those terms without argument. I enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I secured federal research grants by writing proposals late into the night. I worked 60 hours a week in a microbiology laboratory running assays, sanitizing equipment, and logging sample data to cover my housing and meals. I graduated with a perfect grade point average. I earned my master's degree and my specialized certifications entirely on my own dime. I did not resent Carter for his easy path. Resentment is a highly inefficient emotion. I simply observed the data. I tracked the variables. I learned early on that mathematical reality eventually asserts itself regardless of the narrative people try to spin. The disparity between our lives crystallized during a specific Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. We were sitting around the same mahogany table in Concord. Grandfather Theodore was at the head carving the turkey. Sylvia sat to his right holding court and directing the conversation. I had just co-authored my first major statistical analysis for a peer-reviewed medical journal. It was a career-defining milestone. It validated years of sleepless nights and grueling laboratory shifts. When Theodore asked about my publication, Sylvia waved her hand dismissively before I could answer. "It is just glorified bookkeeping," Dad, Sylvia said, while serving herself a portion of cranberry sauce. "Winifred counts things and it is administrative work, so let us talk about something with actual cultural impact. Carter, tell Grandfather about your new opportunity." Carter leaned forward, adjusting the cuffs of a tailored shirt Sylvia had purchased for him the previous week. He announced he had secured an unpaid internship archiving letters for a retired local historian. An unpaid position. He was 31 years old. Sylvia beamed as if he had just announced a cure for a major disease. She raised her wineglass. "To Carter," she said, "a true scholar." I looked at Theodore. He chewed his food slowly. His eyes rested on Carter, then shifted to Sylvia, and finally landed on me. He did not say a word, but the tightness in his jaw registered as a clear metric. Theodore was a retired professor of economics. He understood return on investment. He recognized a deficit when he saw one. I drove back to my apartment in Boston that night and started running the numbers. It was a reflex born of my profession. When a clinical trial shows divergent results, you trace the input sources. I looked at the known data points. Sylvia was a mid-level administrator at a regional historical society. Her salary was a matter of public record. She earned $78,000 a year. She owned her home but still carried a substantial mortgage. Then I calculated Carter's expenditures. Average rent for a luxury 2-bedroom in Cambridge stood at $4,000 a month. The lease and insurance on a new Audi required at least $800 a month. Networking dinners, tailored clothing, travel expenses, and university fees added thousands more to the monthly ledger. The math did not align. Carter's lifestyle required an annual gross income of at least $120,000 just to break even. Sylvia simply did not possess the capital to sustain his existence. Even if she dedicated every cent of her net income to his expenses, she would still fall short by a wide margin. At first, I hypothesized she was drowning in credit card debt. I assumed she was taking out high-interest personal loans or remortgaging her house to keep Carter cloaked in the illusion of success. I chose to stay quiet. Her financial ruin was her own design. I had no intention of stepping in to save her from the consequences of her blatant favoritism. But as the months passed, Carter's expenditures only expanded. He flew to academic conferences in Geneva. He purchased vintage wristwatches. He upgraded his apartment furnishings. The disparity between Sylvia's income and Carter's spending transitioned from a mild curiosity to a glaring statistical anomaly. Money was flowing into Carter's accounts from a source with deep liquid reserves. I started paying closer attention during my Sunday visits to Theodore. Every weekend I drove to Concord to organize his medical files, check his vitals, and refill his prescriptions. Theodore was intellectually sharp, but his physical health required strict management. During those visits, I began noticing subtle changes around the estate. Small valuable items began disappearing. The silver spoons, crafted by Paul Revere, which had occupied the display cabinet for 3 decades, were suddenly gone. When I asked Sylvia about them, she claimed they were out for professional polishing. They never returned. A rare first-edition novel by Nathaniel Hawthorne vanished from the library shelf. Sylvia said Theodore had simply misplaced it in his old age. I documented each missing item. I took photographs of the empty spaces. I recorded the dates of my inquiries and Sylvia's exact responses in a secure, encrypted file on my laptop. I was building a baseline data set. I knew Sylvia was funneling resources to Carter, but I lacked the definitive proof connecting the missing assets to her bank accounts. I needed a verified transaction. The missing items were troubling, but they were physical objects subject to plausible deniability. I required hard digital evidence to prove my hypothesis. I waited with the patience of a researcher observing a long-term behavioral study. People who steal to fund a delusion always escalate their methods. They become comfortable with the theft. They stop covering their tracks. They become sloppy. I sat in my car in the driveway reflecting on that timeline. The engine idled softly. I checked my phone to see if Elias Thorne had messaged me yet. Instead, a different notification illuminated the screen. It was an automated alert from a secure credit monitoring service I had installed years ago. The notification consisted of a few lines of stark white text against a black background. A new line of credit had been opened in my name. The total approved amount was $50,000. I stared at the glowing letters. My resting heart rate remained a steady 65 beats per minute. I did not panic. I opened the banking application and traced the origin of the inquiry. The data populated on the screen verifying the source. The credit line was tied directly to the equity of Theodore's Concord estate. Someone had used my social security number and my grandfather's property to secure a $50,000 loan. The baseline study was officially over. The active phase of the conflict had just begun. The alert glowing on my phone screen confirmed the $50,000 loan. I sat in the cold car and processed the digital footprint. I did not march back into the house to demand answers. Plunging into an emotional confrontation would only play into the narrative my mother had spent the last 24 months constructing. The missing silver and the vanished literature were merely the initial data points in a long-term strategy. Sylvia was orchestrating a methodical campaign to frame me for her financial extraction. To understand why I chose silence, you must understand how the groundwork for this frame-up was laid. 2 years before his passing, Theodore still maintained a portion of his assets in physical bearer bonds. He belonged to an older generation of wealth management that preferred tangible assets you could hold in your hand. He kept these documents in a fireproof lockbox inside his lower desk drawer. During one of my regular Sunday visits to check his blood pressure, I noticed the lockbox sitting at a slight angle. The brass latch hung loose. The bonds were gone. The total value exceeded $30,000. I recorded the date, the time, and the condition of the drawer. Sylvia did not report the missing bonds to the authorities. Instead, she initiated a sequence of calculated whispers among our extended relatives. She planted seeds of doubt during holiday dinners and casual afternoon teas. I stood in the kitchen during a family barbecue and overheard her speaking to an aunt from Lexington. Sylvia swirled her iced tea and sighed. She claimed she worried about my financial stability. She lamented my supposedly crushing student debt. She casually mentioned my expensive tastes and the high cost of city living. The irony was stark. I carried zero student debt. I had funded my education through grueling laboratory shifts and research grants. My apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit. I owned a reliable 6-year-old sedan. I did not buy designer clothing or dine at luxury restaurants. But facts seldom matter when a compelling fiction is presented with authority. Sylvia was laying a foundation of motive. If items went missing, the family would naturally look toward the granddaughter struggling with fictitious debt, rather than the golden child driving a leased luxury vehicle. I did not defend myself to my aunt. I did not correct the record. Massachusetts culture dictates a strict adherence to stoicism. In our social circles, defending yourself against a rumor only validates the accusation. The person who screams loses the intellectual high ground. I chose to observe. I returned to my apartment and created a new encrypted folder on my secure server. I labeled it with a simple alphanumeric code. I began cataloging every microaggression, every passive accusation, and every missing item. The pivotal piece of empirical evidence arrived on a rainy Tuesday in October. Carter had stopped by Theodore's estate to drop off some groceries. I was already there running a software update on my grandfather's computer. Carter tossed his tailored wool jacket over the back of a dining chair and rushed into the kitchen to complain about Boston traffic. The jacket slipped. It hit the hardwood floor. A small rectangular slip of thermal paper fell from the inner pocket. I walked over to retrieve the garment. I picked up the receipt. The ink was fresh. The header displayed the name of a high-end pawnbroker located in the Back Bay neighborhood. The transaction detailed the sale of antique sterling silver flatware. The payout amount was $4,200. The signature at the bottom belonged to my brother. My pulse did not elevate. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I activated the camera and disabled the flash. I took 3 clear, high-resolution photographs of the receipt, ensuring the date, the merchant details, and the signature were perfectly legible. I tucked the paper back into the inner pocket and draped the jacket over the chair exactly as it had fallen. When Carter returned to the room, sipping sparkling water, I was typing on my laptop. He suspected nothing. I uploaded the images to the encrypted folder. The puzzle pieces were locking into a recognizable pattern. Sylvia was not just funding Carter. They were actively liquidating Theodore's tangible legacy to sustain their facade. The pressure cooker hissed for another 6 months. I continued my weekly medical checks. I watched the house slowly empty of its historical weight. A vintage timepiece disappeared. A rare coin collection vanished. Each time Sylvia ensured a subtle remark about my presence in the house reached the ears of our relatives. She was building an impenetrable wall of suspicion around me. I kept my silence. I updated my spreadsheet. I waited for the inevitable fracture. The fracture arrived not through financial ruin, but through biology. It was a freezing Sunday in February. I was taking Theodore's resting heart rate in his study. He reached for his cup of black tea and his hand faltered. The porcelain shattered against the mahogany desk. I looked at his face. The left side of his mouth drooped. His eyes widened in sudden confusion. When he tried to speak, the words emerged as a slurred, unrecognizable hum. He was suffering an ischemic stroke. My training took over. I bypassed panic and operated on pure procedural logic. I noted the exact time of symptom onset. I dialed emergency services and provided a concise clinical description of his condition. I unlocked the front door and cleared the path for the paramedics. I rode in the back of the ambulance, monitoring the screens. The stroke was mild, but the consequences were permanent. Theodore survived. He regained his speech and most of his motor function, but his physical stamina was decimated. The doctors mandated round-the-clock observation and a severe reduction in stress. This biological event triggered a catastrophic shift in the family dynamic. The estate transitioned into emergency mode. Sylvia seized the opportunity with terrifying speed. While Theodore rested in the hospital recovery ward, she moved into the Concord house full-time. She claimed she needed to manage his care and secure the property. In reality, she was securing her access. She changed the alarm codes. She hired private nurses and instructed them to limit my visiting hours, citing my supposedly disruptive influence. She took possession of his incoming mail. The stroke provided the perfect smokescreen for financial chaos. With Theodore confined to a medical bed and his cognitive energy focused entirely on physical rehabilitation, the remaining guardrails protecting his assets were removed. Sylvia now held unchecked proximity to his files, his checkbooks, and his personal identification documents. The disappearance of tangible items like silver spoons and books escalated into the manipulation of liquid capital. The pressure cooker had finally cracked open. The stage was set for the $50,000 loan alert that currently glowed on my phone screen in the cold driveway. I was no longer observing a slow extraction. I was watching a hostile takeover. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the study. My grandfather sat in the ambient glow of his brass reading lamp. He wore a tweed cardigan over a crisp button-down shirt. His left hand rested on the arm of his customized orthopedic chair. The physical toll of the stroke was visible in the slight slump of his shoulder, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. He looked at the leather satchel in my hand. I did not offer pleasantries or ask about his day. I approached the mahogany desk and retrieved my secure tablet. I unlocked the screen and opened the master spreadsheet. I placed the device directly in front of him. I informed him we needed to review a dataset regarding recent household expenditures. Theodore adjusted his reading glasses. He spent 20 minutes scrolling through the rows of organized data. He examined the high-resolution photographs of the pawn shop receipts I had extracted from Carter's jacket. He read the public registration documents for the technology venture Carter had incorporated in the Seaport district. He scrutinized the forged signature on the $50,000 home equity line of credit. The room remained silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock and the soft tap of his index finger against the glass screen. A lesser man would have raged. A typical father would have wept at the magnitude of his daughter's betrayal. Theodore did neither. He was a retired professor of macroeconomic theory. He spent his entire career analyzing market failures, identifying corrupt variables, and studying human greed. He viewed emotional outbursts as a profound failure of intellect. Theodore closed the application. He slid the tablet back across the polished wood. He unlocked the lower right drawer of his desk. He reached inside and withdrew a heavy iron key. The metal was dark and unpolished, cold to the touch. He placed the key on the desk between us. He looked me directly in the eyes. "Numbers do not lie, but my daughter does," he said. His voice was steady and devoid of any theatrical sorrow. I realized in that moment my presentation was not a revelation to him. It was a confirmation. Theodore had suspected the extraction of his assets for months. He had noticed the missing silver spoons. He noted the sudden disappearance of the bearer bonds long before I secured the digital evidence. Rather than confronting Sylvia, he chose to observe her methodology. He allowed her to operate under the assumption that his cognitive faculties were declining. He weaponized his stroke, using it as a tactical advantage to study her theft without interruption. Theodore instructed me to retrieve a business card from his rotary file. The name printed on the thick cardstock belonged to Elias Thorne. Elias was a senior partner at a boutique accounting firm in Boston. He had managed Theodore's private finances for 3 decades. Theodore informed me that Elias was waiting for my call. I dialed the number right there in the study. Elias Thorne arrived at the Concord estate the following afternoon. He bypassed Sylvia by entering through the private terrace doors attached to the study. Elias embodied the stoic precision of traditional Massachusetts wealth management. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a pristine leather briefcase. He did not engage in trivial conversation or offer empty sympathies regarding the family betrayal. The 3 of us sat around the mahogany desk. Elias opened his briefcase and laid out a series of drafted legal instruments. Theodore explained his strategy. He was not merely disinheriting Sylvia and Carter, he was engineering a legal labyrinth. Elias had already begun the process of restructuring the entire estate to ensure Sylvia could never touch the principal wealth. They created a formidable blind trust. The primary assets, including the Concord property, the historical archives, and the liquid investment portfolios, were quietly transferred out of Theodore's direct ownership. The trust was designed to bypass the probate courts, entirely shielding the assets from public scrutiny and familial challenges. The documents designated a sole controlling trustee to take power upon Theodore's death. That trustee was me. Elias detailed the most crucial element of the architecture. Theodore was intentionally letting Sylvia steal the remaining accessible funds to build an airtight federal case. Every time she forged a signature or authorized a wire transfer, Elias documented the routing numbers and the internet protocol addresses. They were gathering pristine, undeniable evidence of wire fraud. The legal framework functioned as a dead man switch. If Sylvia and Carter accepted their eventual disinheritance silently, the evidence would remain sealed in Elias's vault. If they attempted to contest the trust or claim the remaining estate, Elias was bound by his fiduciary duty to hand the entire ledger over to the state attorney general. Theodore was giving them the rope and allowing them to decide whether or not to tie the knot. The alliance forged in that study deepened my connection with my grandfather. We did not share tearful embraces or sentimental speeches. We shared a cold mutual respect. We operated as colleagues navigating a hostile corporate takeover. I tucked the heavy iron key into my coat pocket. It belonged to a secure deposit box in downtown Boston where Elias kept the original trust documents. I continued my Sunday visits to check Theodore's vitals. Sylvia lingered in the background, hovering like a vulture anticipating a meal. She remained entirely unaware that the quiet granddaughter taking blood pressure readings was now holding the keys to the kingdom. We maintained the facade for 8 more months. Sylvia grew bolder with her extractions. She dismissed the private nurses early and restricted Theodore's diet, claiming she was managing his health to save money. I watched her parade Carter through the house, pointing out antique furniture he could sell to fund his non-existent software development. One afternoon, Carter stood in the study pitching his imaginary tech platform to Theodore. He used buzzwords and projected fake revenue models. Theodore just nodded slowly, sipping his tea. He was watching a parasite boast about draining a host that was already empty. I recorded every comment in my secure file. Elias tracked every stolen dollar in his ledger. The inevitable biological conclusion arrived on a Tuesday evening in November. I was in my laboratory running a sequence analysis when the hospital called. Theodore had suffered a severe secondary infarction. His heart could no longer sustain the damage. By the time I navigated the evening traffic to the cardiac intensive care unit, he was gone. I stood at the foot of his hospital bed. The monitors were dark. The room was silent. I placed my hand on his shoulder and honored his memory with the stoicism he taught me. Sylvia burst through the double doors 10 minutes later. She carried a designer handbag she had purchased with his stolen equity. She bypassed me entirely and demanded to speak with the attending physician about securing the death certificate. She did not shed a single tear or offer a word of comfort. She viewed his passing as a logistical hurdle she had finally cleared. She believed the estate was now hers to command. Her manufactured crisis was about to begin, and I was ready to watch her step directly into the snare we built. I did not offer trivial pleasantries. I approached the mahogany desk and retrieved my tablet. I unlocked the screen and opened the master spreadsheet. I placed the device directly in front of him. I informed him that we needed to review a dataset regarding recent household expenditures and unauthorized credit inquiries. Theodore adjusted his reading glasses. He spent 20 minutes scrolling through the organized rows of data. He examined the high-resolution photographs of the pawn shop receipts I had extracted from my brother's jacket. He read the public registration documents for the technology venture Carter had incorporated in the Seaport district. He scrutinized the forged signature on the $50,000 home equity line of credit that Sylvia had tethered to my Social Security number. The room remained silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock and the soft tap of his index finger against the glass screen. A lesser man would have yelled. A typical father would have wept at the magnitude of his daughter betraying him in his final years. Theodore did neither. He understood that betrayal was just another variable in a complex equation. He closed the application. He slid the tablet back across the polished wood. He unlocked the lower right drawer of his desk. He reached inside and withdrew a heavy iron key. The metal was dark and unpolished. He placed the key on the desk between us. He looked me directly in the eyes. "Numbers do not lie, but my daughter does," he said. His voice was steady and devoid of theatrical sorrow. I realized in that moment my presentation was not a revelation to him. It was a confirmation. Theodore had suspected the extraction of his assets for months. He had noticed the missing silver spoons. He noted the sudden disappearance of the bearer bonds long before I secured the digital evidence. Rather than confronting Sylvia, he chose to observe her methodology. He allowed her to operate under the assumption that his cognitive faculties were declining. He weaponized his physical vulnerability, using it as a tactical advantage to study her theft without interruption. Theodore instructed me to retrieve a business card from his rotary file. The name printed on the thick cardstock belonged to Elias Thorne. Elias was a senior partner at a boutique accounting firm in Boston. He had managed Theodore's private finances for 3 decades. Theodore informed me that Elias was waiting for my call. I dialed the number right there in the study. Elias Thorne arrived at the Concord estate the following afternoon. He bypassed Sylvia by entering through the private terrace doors attached to the study. Elias embodied the stoic precision of traditional Massachusetts wealth management. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a pristine leather briefcase. He did not engage in trivial conversation or offer empty sympathies regarding the family betrayal. He operated with the clinical detachment of a surgeon preparing to excise a tumor. The 3 of us sat around the mahogany desk. Elias opened his briefcase and laid out a series of drafted legal instruments. Theodore explained his strategy. He was not merely disinheriting Sylvia and Carter, he was engineering a legal labyrinth. Elias had already begun the process of restructuring the entire estate to ensure Sylvia could never touch the principal wealth. They created a formidable blind trust. The primary assets, including the Concord property, the historical archives, and the liquid investment portfolios, were quietly transferred out of Theodore's direct ownership. The trust was designed to bypass the probate courts entirely, shielding the assets from public scrutiny and familial challenges. The documents designated a sole controlling trustee to take power upon Theodore's death. That trustee was me. Elias detailed the most crucial element of the architecture. Theodore was intentionally letting Sylvia steal the remaining accessible funds to build an airtight federal case. Every time she forged a signature or authorized a wire transfer, Elias documented the routing numbers and the Internet protocol addresses. They were gathering pristine, undeniable evidence of wire fraud. Sylvia thought she was draining a dying man. In reality, she was handing a meticulous accountant the exact coordinates of her own destruction. Theodore had built his fortune not through inheritance, but through decades of disciplined market analysis. He viewed wealth as a tool for intellectual advancement, not a mechanism to fund mediocrity. Carter represented everything Theodore despised. My brother was a man who consumed resources without generating value. Sylvia enabled this consumption because she equated financial expenditure with social status. Theodore recognized that his daughter and grandson were locked in a symbiotic cycle of delusion. He refused to let his life work become fuel for their vanity. When Elias explained the mechanics of the blind trust, he outlined the specific protections embedded within the clauses. Massachusetts trust law provides robust mechanisms for shielding assets if the grantor constructs the document with precise intent. The trust contained a stringent no-contest provision. Any beneficiary attempting to challenge the validity of the document would immediately forfeit their standing. Furthermore, the trust held an arbitration mandate, ensuring that any disputes would be handled outside the public court system, denying Sylvia the spectacle she so desperately craved. The legal framework functioned as a dead man switch. If Sylvia and Carter accepted their eventual disinheritance silently, the evidence would remain sealed in Elias's vault. If they attempted to contest the trust or claim the remaining estate, Elias was bound by his fiduciary duty to hand the entire ledger over to the state attorney general. Theodore was giving them the rope and allowing them to decide whether or not to tie the knot. I sat in the study listening to these men dissect the legal code with surgical accuracy. I felt a profound sense of validation. For years, my mother had dismissed my career as mere data entry. Now the very skills she mocked were serving as the foundation for her undoing. My ability to track variables, isolate anomalies, and construct logical models had earned my grandfather's ultimate trust. He did not hand me control of his estate because we shared genetic material. He handed me control because I was the only person in the family capable of defending it. The alliance forged in that study deepened my connection with my grandfather. We did not share tearful embraces or sentimental speeches. We shared a cold, mutual respect. We operated as colleagues, navigating a hostile corporate takeover. I tucked the heavy iron key into my coat pocket. It belonged to a secure deposit box in downtown Boston where Elias kept the original trust documents. We maintained the facade for 8 more months. Sylvia grew bolder with her extractions. She dismissed the private nurses early and restricted Theodore's diet, claiming she was managing his health to save money. I watched her parade Carter through the house, pointing out antique furniture he could sell to fund his non-existent software development. One afternoon, Carter stood in the study pitching his imaginary tech platform to Theodore. He used buzzwords and projected fake revenue models. Theodore just nodded slowly, sipping his tea. He was watching a parasite boast about draining a host that was already empty. I recorded every comment in my secure file. Elias tracked every stolen dollar in his ledger. The trap was set and waiting for the final trigger. The inevitable biological conclusion arrived on a Tuesday evening in November. The winter air was crisp and unforgiving. I was in my laboratory running a sequence analysis when the hospital called. Theodore had suffered a severe secondary infarction. His heart could no longer sustain the damage inflicted by the initial stroke. By the time I navigated the evening traffic to the cardiac intensive care unit, he was gone. I stood at the foot of his hospital bed. The monitors were dark. The room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. I looked at his face. The tension that had defined his final months was erased. I placed my hand on his shoulder and honored his memory with the stoicism he taught me. There was no need for weeping. We had finished our work. The data was secure. The parameters were set. Sylvia burst through the double doors 10 minutes later. She brought the chaos of the outside world into the sterile room. She carried a designer handbag she had purchased with his stolen equity. She bypassed me entirely and demanded to speak with the attending physician about securing the death certificate. She did not shed a single tear or offer a word of comfort. She viewed his passing as a logistical hurdle she had finally cleared. She believed the estate was now hers to command. Her manufactured crisis was about to begin. She would soon lock the doors of the Concord house and attempt to control the narrative. She did not realize that the narrative had been written months ago by a biostatistician, an accountant, and an economics professor. I stepped out of the hospital room and walked down the quiet corridor. The final phase of our protocol was officially active. The day following the hospital failure, the Concord estate transformed. It ceased being a quiet refuge for an ailing economics professor and became a staging ground for predatory grief. Extended relatives arrived in droves. Aunts, uncles, and second cousins descended upon the Massachusetts property like locusts drawn to a harvest. They parked their sedans along the gravel driveway and filled the foyer with performative sorrow. I stood near the mahogany staircase and watched the spectacle unfold. As a biostatistician, I observe how organisms behave when a central stabilizing structure collapses. The immediate result is chaos, followed quickly by a brutal reorganization of power. Sylvia seized that power before Theodore was even transported to the funeral home. She commandeered the household, displaying a terrifying administrative efficiency. She intercepted condolence bouquets. She directed the catering staff. She positioned herself as the unquestioned authority holding the heavy burden of leadership. Her performance was technically flawless. It catered perfectly to the rigid social expectations of our New England circles, where stoicism is prized, but a visible exertion of control is deeply respected. Her first act of overt hostility occurred on Wednesday morning. I walked down the rear hallway, intending to enter Theodore's study. I needed to retrieve my charging cable, which I had left on the side table during my previous visit. Sylvia stood blocking the heavy oak door. She had physically locked the deadbolt. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and crossed her arms as I approached. "You are not going in there, Winifred," she said. Her tone was sharp, meant to carry down the corridor so a passing aunt could hear. I stopped 3 feet away. I simply looked at the brass keyhole, then back at her face. "I am sealing the private rooms." Sylvia continued, elevating her volume slightly. "We have to protect the estate from scavengers. People get desperate when wealth changes hands. I will not have items growing legs and walking out the door." She stared at me, waiting for the spark to ignite. The provocation was unmistakable. She wanted me to act offended. She wanted me to raise my voice and demand entry. If I escalated the confrontation, she could immediately brand me as erratic or defensive. It is a classic psychological tactic. Force the target to exhibit instability and then use that instability to invalidate their character. I did not give her the data point she required. My resting heart rate remained entirely undisturbed. I nodded once. "That is a prudent security measure, Sylvia," I replied. I turned on my heel and walked back toward the kitchen. I did not need access to the physical study. The iron key to the secure deposit box was already safe inside my Boston apartment. The digital ledgers were encrypted on external servers. Let her guard an empty fortress. While Sylvia fortified the perimeter, Carter roamed the interior. My brother treated the grieving household as a victory lap. He paced the hardwood floors with a proprietary swagger, holding a cup of espresso and speaking loudly to anyone who would listen. He lacked the subtlety required for Massachusetts high society. He possessed all the entitlement but none of the tactical restraint. I stood in the kitchen pouring a glass of water and listened to him corner Uncle Thomas near the pantry. "Grandfather and I had an understanding," Carter proclaimed. "He promised me the property. We had a verbal agreement right here in this room just last month. He knew my historical data venture needed a prestigious headquarters. The liquid capital is transitioning to my control to facilitate the launch." Uncle Thomas offered a non-committal hum. He was a vascular surgeon who recognized a delusion but preferred to avoid diagnosing it at a family wake. Carter was projecting a fantasy to manifest reality. He believed that if he repeated the lie frequently enough, the sheer force of his confidence would render it true. He was a man drowning in debt, grasping at a verbal contract that never existed. I found his behavior fascinating from a clinical perspective. The human brain will construct elaborate defense mechanisms to shield itself from impending ruin. An hour later, I witnessed the zenith of his detachment from reality. I walked past the formal living room. Carter stood near the bay window holding a yellow retractable tape measure. He pulled the metal ribbon across the length of the Persian rug, muttering numbers under his breath. He tapped data into his smartphone. I paused in the doorway and asked what he was calculating. He did not look up. "I am checking the clearance for a Steinway piano," he said. "A grand piano requires specific acoustics. This corner provides optimal resonance. It will elevate the space nicely for investor dinners." He was sizing up a room he did not own for an instrument he could not afford, using funds that were legally locked inside a blind trust. He was spending ghost money. I did not correct his measurements. I did not inform him that his startup was a fraudulent shell or that his academic career was built on forged loan applications. I merely logged the interaction in my mental ledger. Every arrogant assumption they made now would multiply the devastation of their eventual collapse. The psychological warfare intensified as the week progressed. Sylvia recognized that her direct provocations were failing. I navigated the estate like a ghost, offering polite condolences to extended relatives while remaining entirely detached from the underlying friction. My refusal to engage frustrated her. A narrative requires a villain, and the villain was refusing to play her assigned role. She shifted her strategy from private isolation to public spectacle. If I would not fight her in the hallway, she would force me into the arena. On Friday evening, the majority of the family gathered in the main dining hall. Catered platters of cold cuts and artisan cheeses covered the table. The atmosphere was subdued but restless. The initial shock of Theodore passing had faded, replaced by the unspoken anticipation of the inheritance reading. Everyone present held a vested interest in the distribution of assets. Sylvia stood at the head of the table, tapping a silver spoon against a crystal water glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low murmur of conversations. 30 faces turned toward her. "I require everyone's attention," she announced. Her voice carried the weight of impending authority. I leaned against the doorframe, observing the scene. Carter stood beside her, crossing his arms and assuming a posture of solemn solidarity. "As we prepare to honor my father and transition into the next phase of managing his legacy, we must address a deeply troubling issue," Sylvia said. "I have spent the past 48 hours reviewing his personal files. I uncovered significant financial irregularities. It appears Theodore was subjected to severe exploitation during his final months." A wave of uneasy whispers swept through the room. Aunts exchanged nervous glances. Uncles shifted their weight. Sylvia held up her hand to quell the noise. "I will not allow this betrayal to remain hidden in the shadows. We pride ourselves on integrity in this family. Tomorrow afternoon, immediately following the memorial service, we will convene in the living room. I will present the evidence regarding these discrepancies. We will handle this matter transparently and decisively." She locked eyes with me across the length of the dining room. Her gaze was challenging, hungry, and triumphant. She was laying the trap in broad daylight. She believed she held the winning hand. She thought the forged documents and the missing silver would weave a net tight enough to suffocate me in front of our entire social circle. I held her stare. I did not break contact. I offered a single slow nod of acknowledgement. "Tomorrow afternoon," I said evenly. "I look forward to the presentation." I turned and walked out of the dining hall. The trap was set. The manufactured crisis had reached its boiling point. Sylvia had built her stage, gathered her audience, and drafted her script. She had no idea that the silent architect she intended to execute was the one holding the match. Saturday morning arrived, wrapped in a shroud of gray New England clouds. I stood in the sterile environment of my Boston kitchen, watching the coffee brew. My apartment mirrors my cognitive process. The surfaces are clear of obstruction. The geometry is sharp. I do not permit sentimental clutter to occupy physical space. Today was the designated day of the memorial service and the subsequent family tribunal. I had spent the nocturnal hours running behavioral simulations, mapping the permutations of my mother's impending attack. My mobile device vibrated against the granite island. The incoming number was masked. I answered the call and verified my identity using a predetermined authentication phrase. Elias Thorne was on the other end of the encrypted application. Elias spoke with the brisk utility of a man who views time as a finite currency. He informed me that our projected timeline required immediate adjustment. The conflict was accelerating ahead of schedule. Sylvia had not spent her morning in quiet reflection honoring her deceased father. She had spent the early hours attempting to execute a hostile financial maneuver. Elias explained the mechanics of her failed extraction with the precision of an auditor presenting findings to a board of directors. At precisely 8 o'clock that morning, Sylvia entered a private wealth management branch in Lexington. She approached a senior banking officer and delivered a notarized power of attorney document. Her instructions were explicit. She ordered the branch manager to liquidate a high-yield mutual fund portfolio and transfer the entirety of the proceeds into an external shell account she had recently opened under her sole control. Elias paused, letting the gravity of her miscalculations settle between us. Elias had served as Theodore's primary financial architect for 3 decades. He belonged to a lineage of Boston wealth managers who treated fiduciary duty with a religious fervor. He knew every statutory loophole in state banking laws, and he had methodically sealed them all. The power of attorney Sylvia attempted to leverage was a crude forgery, Elias said. His voice remained incredibly flat, devoid of surprise or outrage. She backdated her signature and the notary's stamp to a week before Theodore passed away. She assumed the banking institution would process the liquidation over the weekend without verifying the living status of the primary account holder. But Sylvia was operating blindly. She did not know about the covert restructuring we executed in the study. She did not know the mutual fund had been legally absorbed into the blind trust months ago, insulating the capital from any standard power of attorney claim. The internal banking algorithms flagged the transfer request instantly. The branch manager halted the liquidation and contacted Elias, who held the ultimate executive authority over the trust portfolio. I leaned against the granite counter and absorbed the data points. My mother was escalating from covert domestic theft to overt bank fraud. She was acting out of pure, unadulterated panic. She is trapped, Elias told me, over the secure connection. She realizes the liquid capital is blocked. She knows the physical assets are legally locked. Her only remaining strategy is a preemptive strike to distract the stakeholders. Elias outlined the psychological profile of a cornered financial predator. Sylvia desperately needed a scapegoat to account for the missing funds before the estate underwent a formal probate audit. If she could convince our extended relatives that I had systematically drained the accounts, she could weaponize their collective outrage to mask her own paper trail. The formal family gathering she had announced for this afternoon was not a transparent discussion of discrepancies. It was a kangaroo court engineered to execute my personal and professional reputation. I asked Elias how we should calibrate our counter-offensive. "We do nothing," he replied. He issued a strict binding directive. "Let her talk. Do not interrupt her presentation. Do not offer a single syllable of defense. Let her lay out every fabricated detail in front of 30 witnesses." I grasped the brilliance of his strategy instantly. In complex statistical modeling, you never interrupt an anomalous variable while it generates fresh data. You allow the pattern to run its natural course until the error rate becomes mathematically undeniable. If I interrupted her accusations, she could pivot. She could adjust her narrative on the fly to account for my defense. If I remained completely silent, she would grow overconfident. She would weave a web of lies so elaborate and detailed that she would inevitably entangle herself in the threads of her own perjury. Let her commit to the lie, Elias instructed. Once she establishes her fictional narrative on the public record, she cannot walk it back. We are not setting a trap, Winifred. We are simply handing her the shovel and watching her dig the trench. I agreed to his terms. We synchronized our operational timelines. He instructed me to endure the accusations stoically and walk out of the living room precisely when her presentation reached its zenith. He would be waiting outside in his vehicle, prepared to cross the threshold and deliver the final empirical blow. I ended the call and finished my coffee. The dark liquid tasted bitter and grounding. I walked into my bedroom to prepare for the memorial. I selected my wardrobe with tactical intent. I bypassed the traditional mourning dresses preferred by the women in my family. I chose a crisp white tailored blouse and charcoal trousers. I needed to project clinical authority rather than emotional vulnerability. I pulled my hair back into a severe knot. I applied no cosmetic enhancements. I wanted my face to serve as a blank canvas reflecting nothing but empirical reality. The drive from Boston to Concord took 45 minutes. The highway stretched ahead, gray and unforgiving under the winter sky. I drove in silence, running mental rehearsals of the upcoming confrontation. I analyzed Carter measuring the living room for a grand piano he would never purchase. I visualized Sylvia guarding a locked study that held nothing but empty drawers and irrelevant paperwork. They were operating under the delusion that they controlled the chessboard. They did not comprehend that the board had been flipped months prior. I navigated the winding suburban roads of Middlesex County. The bare trees stood like stoic sentinels guarding the historic properties. I turned onto the private road leading to my grandfather's estate. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, echoing the sound of gears locking into place within a larger machine. The circular driveway was already congested with vehicles. Sedans and luxury sport utility vehicles sat parked in neat symmetrical rows. The entire extended family had arrived. They came ostensibly to mourn Theodore, but they stayed for the promised spectacle. They were esteemed academics and medical professionals who prided themselves on logic and reason, yet they were about to willingly consume a diet of pure theatrical fiction. I found a spot near the outer edge of the driveway, pointing the nose of my car toward the exit. It was a strategic positioning designed for an unimpeded departure. I turned off the ignition, but remained in the driver's seat for several minutes, observing the house. Smoke curled gracefully from the stone chimney. Warm light spilled onto the frozen manicured lawn. It projected an image of upper-class tranquility. I knew it was a den of vipers waiting to strike. My mobile phone vibrated once in my pocket. A brief text message from Elias confirmed his town car was en route and holding position nearby. I took a slow, deep breath. I monitored my pulse. Steady, rhythmic, unbothered. I was a scientist stepping into a highly contaminated testing environment. My job was not to fight the contamination. My job was to let the subjects ingest it while I documented the results. I opened the car door and stepped out into the biting December cold. I retrieved my navy wool peacoat from the passenger seat. I slid my arms into the sleeves and fastened the buttons one by one from bottom to top. I smoothed the lapels, ensuring every line of my clothing was sharp, deliberate, and unyielding. I looked at the heavy oak front door of my grandfather's house. Behind that barrier, my mother was sharpening her knives. She thought I was walking into an ambush. She did not know I was the silent architect of her impending execution. I walked toward the firing squad of my own blood relatives. I crossed the threshold into the foyer. The grandfather clock ticked with mechanical rhythm. The scent of funeral lilies and expensive perfume hung heavy in the heated air. I navigated through clusters of relatives wearing dark suits and conservative dresses. They murmured condolences that felt practiced and hollow. I nodded politely, making my way to the formal living room. Sylvia had rearranged the furniture to create an auditorium setting. The central seating now faced the unlit hearth. A portable projection screen stood awkwardly in front of the fireplace. A digital projector rested on the mahogany coffee table, humming quietly. Sylvia was treating a family tragedy like a corporate shareholder meeting. She had gathered the most influential members of our lineage. My uncle, the dean of admissions at a prominent university, sat in the front row. Two cousins who ran a successful vascular surgery practice occupied the sofa. They were all individuals who built their lives on academic prestige and social integrity. They were the perfect jury for a character assassination. Carter leaned against the mantelpiece. He wore a bespoke morning suit he had undoubtedly purchased using stolen equity. He held a glass of sparkling water, looking suitably grim. He played his part well, projecting the aura of a loyal heir burdened by impending sorrow. He adjusted his cuffs and offered a solemn nod to the assembled guests. Sylvia tapped a silver spoon against a crystal tumbler. The sharp ringing sound commanded immediate silence. The room settled into a hushed anticipation. I took my seat in the leather wingback chair near the bay window. I pulled out my phone not to distract myself, but to monitor the exact time. 2:15 in the afternoon. Elias Thorne was instructed to wait outside until my signal. Sylvia clicked a remote control. The projector cast a harsh white light onto the screen. A spreadsheet appeared. The header read, "Estate discrepancies and unauthorized withdrawals." Sylvia stood beside the screen using a red laser pointer to highlight specific cells. She did not shout. She modulated her voice to project a profound, weary disappointment. Her tone was calculated to evoke sympathy rather than hostility. She began with the tangible items. She clicked to a slide displaying a photograph of the empty display cabinet where the Paul Revere silver spoons used to reside. She displayed a scanned pawn shop receipt. It was a forgery, of course. It was a manipulated copy of the very receipt I had photographed in Carter Jacket months ago. The signature at the bottom had been clumsily altered to resemble mine. She claimed I used my proximity to Theodore during my Sunday medical checks to pilfer his assets piece by piece. Then came the grand finale. A new slide detailed a $50,000 home equity line of credit. Sylvia explained how the funds were drained over the last 2 years. She combined the missing silver, the vanished bearer bonds, and the fraudulent loan to arrive at a staggering total, $140,000. Sylvia turned to the audience. She wove a narrative of a struggling scientist drowning in student loans, unable to keep pace with the prestige of her peers. She painted me as a bitter, desperate woman who exploited a vulnerable old man to finance a lifestyle I could not afford. She leaned heavily into the Massachusetts culture of academic elitism, implying my state university degree left me financially crippled and morally compromised. She claimed I was secretly funneling the money to cover massive credit card debts. The academics and surgeons in the room absorbed the data. They gasped softly. They shook their heads. My uncle pinched the bridge of his nose in dismay. A cousin I had not seen since undergrad shifted her gaze to the Persian rug, unable to look at me. They looked at me with varying degrees of pity and disgust. They had already convicted me in their minds based entirely on a PowerPoint presentation. Carter sighed audibly. He stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on Sylvia's shoulder. He embodied the dutiful son perfectly. He looked at me with narrowed eyes, feigning heartbreak over my supposed treachery. "We tried to help you, Winifred," he said softly, shaking his head. "We could have found a better way." Sylvia clicked the remote one last time. The screen went blank, leaving an afterimage on the retina. She picked up a manila folder from the mantel. She withdrew a single sheet of thick legal paper. She walked across the Persian rug and stopped 3 feet from my chair. She held the paper out toward me. Her hand was steady. She explained the document was a formal relinquishment of rights. If I signed it, I would forfeit any claims to Theodore Estate. In exchange, Sylvia promised she would not present her fabricated evidence to the district attorney. She framed the extortion as an act of maternal mercy. "Sign the paper, Winifred," she commanded softly, "and we can keep this tragedy within the family. You will walk away with nothing, but you will keep your freedom. We will not press charges if you simply disappear." The tension in the room was palpable. The air grew thin. The audience waited for my eruption. They expected me to snatch the paper, tear it into pieces, and scream my innocence. They wanted a meltdown to justify their condemnation. They wanted me to behave like the erratic criminal Sylvia described. Instead, I looked past the document and focused on the printed spreadsheet still glowing faintly on the projection screen. My analytical training took over. I scanned the columns, mapping the data points. I identified a glaring discrepancy in cell C12. Sylvia had miscalculated the compound interest on the forged credit line. The formula was broken, generating a figure that was mathematically impossible given the loan origination date. I moved my eyes to row 20. She had double-counted the value of the bearer bonds, adding the principal face value to the estimated auction value. It was an amateur accounting mistake. Finally, I found a third error in the date formatting of the pawnshop receipt. The day listed was a Sunday. High-end pawnbrokers in Back Bay do not operate on Sundays due to municipal commerce regulations. Her arithmetic was sloppy. Her timeline was flawed. Her entire presentation would disintegrate under the scrutiny of a competent auditor. I did not point out these mathematical errors. Correcting her data would imply I recognized the legitimacy of her premise. I refused to participate in her fiction. I would not validate her performance with a verbal response. Engaging with bad data only legitimizes the flawed methodology. I locked my phone and slipped it into my pocket. I stood up. The leather chair sighed under the shifting weight. I smoothed the wrinkles from my charcoal trousers. I retrieved my navy wool peacoat from the side table. I slid my arms into the sleeves. I fastened the buttons from the bottom up. 1, 2, 3, 4. Every eye in the room remained fixed on my hands. Sylvia stood frozen, the relinquishment document trembling slightly in her grip. I looked at her directly. I did not speak a single syllable. I turned my back to the projection screen and walked toward the foyer. The silence behind me was profound. Winifred, Sylvia called out, her voice fracturing. "Do not walk away from this. If you walk out that door, you are finished in this family." I grasped the brass handle of the front door, pressed the latch, and pulled. The winter wind swept into the entryway, biting my face. I stepped out onto the granite porch and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The latch clicked into place, severing the accusation and leaving my mother alone with an audience she could no longer control. I stood on the porch for a fraction of a second. The cold air filled my lungs. I glanced back through the narrow sidelight window next to the doorframe. The vantage point afforded me a clear line of sight back into the living room. Sylvia was standing in the center of the Persian rug. She was not angry. She lowered the legal document to her side. The edges of her mouth curled upward into a distinct, triumphant smile. She believed my silence was a confession. She thought my departure was a permanent retreat. She assumed she had secured absolute victory over the estate and successfully eliminated the only obstacle in her path. She did not realize she had just triggered the final phase of the protocol. I walked across the frozen granite of the front porch and descended the stone steps. The December air was a physical weight pressing against my wool peacoat. I reached my sedan parked precisely where I had left it, facing the exit of the circular driveway. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed myself inside. I did not turn the key in the ignition. The engine remained silent. The ambient temperature inside the cabin began to drop, matching the winter chill outside. I rested my wrists on the steering wheel and checked my smartwatch. My resting heart rate read exactly 65 beats per minute. A standard biological baseline. There were no tears blurring my vision. My respiratory rate was even. Sylvia assumed I was fleeing in a state of emotional collapse. She thought I was currently weeping over the dashboard, shattered by the weight of her public condemnation. She did not comprehend that I was merely stepping out of the blast radius before the controlled demolition commenced. 10 minutes after I exited the living room, my smartphone vibrated against the center console. Then it vibrated again. A continuous, rhythmic buzzing signaled the beginning of the digital onslaught. The jury had delivered its verdict, and the executioners were eager to carry out the sentence. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. The notification center overflowed with incoming messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins. The academic elite of my family had abandoned their cultivated restraint for unfiltered vitriol. My uncle, the university dean, sent a lengthy paragraph expressing profound disgust. He stated my actions were a permanent stain on the Prescott legacy. He demanded I return inside immediately and issue a formal apology to my mother. A cousin who managed a prominent surgical practice texted me a single sentence, calling me a disgrace to Theodore and his memory. A second cousin, threatening corporate litigation, warned me to sign the relinquishment document by nightfall. I read every message with clinical detachment. I did not type a single reply. This waiting period was a necessary phase of the protocol. I needed the isolation. I needed them to put their loyalty to Sylvia on the digital record. The sheer volume of their hostility established the absolute depth of their betrayal. For 34 years, I had existed on the periphery of this family, quietly observing their hypocrisy while earning my own keep. I had tolerated their condescension and absorbed their subtle insults. Now presented with a fabricated spreadsheet, they enthusiastically tore me apart without requesting a single piece of corroborating evidence. Their intellectual rigor evaporated the moment they were offered a convenient scapegoat. They did not want the truth, they simply wanted a target. I placed the smartphone face down on the passenger seat, muting the notifications. I retrieved my laptop from my leather satchel. I opened the screen and activated a secure mobile hotspot. The interior of the car glowed with the pale blue light of the monitor. I launched an encrypted file transfer protocol connecting directly to the private server maintained by Elias Thorne. The connection verified with a sequence of cryptographic keys. I highlighted the master folder containing the culmination of my 2-year investigation. The folder held the high-resolution photographs of the pawn shop receipts. It contained the property records proving the fraudulent home equity line of credit. It housed the digital footprint of Carter and his failed technology startup, along with the routing numbers linking the checking account to his phantom expenditures. I initiated the synchronization process. A progress bar appeared on the screen calculating the upload speed. I watched the data packets transfer from my local drive to the secure vault. Each byte of data represented a nail sealing the coffin of my mother and her deception. The synchronization reached 100%. The files were now legally protected and securely staged for the next phase of the operation. While the laptop remained open, I navigated to a different web portal. I accessed my personal healthcare network database. As a biostatistician who frequently works in high-security laboratory environments handling volatile pathogens, I am required to maintain up-to-date emergency contact information. For the past decade, Sylvia and Carter had occupied those primary slots. It was a vestige of societal expectation rather than a reflection of actual reliability. I clicked the cursor on the name of my mother. I selected the option to delete the record. The system prompted me to confirm the removal. I pressed enter. Her name vanished from the screen. I repeated the process for my brother. His contact information disappeared into the digital ether. I was methodically severing the remaining administrative ties connecting me to my blood relatives. By deleting them from my medical portal, I was making a definitive choice. If I collapsed in a laboratory tomorrow, they would not be notified. They would have no legal authority over my care or my assets. I was executing a digital estrangement, finalizing my status as an orphan by choice. The arithmetic was simple. You do not keep parasites on your emergency contact list. The designated 2-hour incubation period progressed slowly. I closed the laptop and stored it back in my satchel. The temperature inside the sedan had plummeted, causing frost to form along the edges of the windshield. I could see my breath pluming in the cold air. I watched the Concord estate through the glass. The grand colonial structure stood resolute against the winter sky. Inside that warm mahogany-paneled living room, they were likely celebrating their perceived victory. Sylvia was probably accepting condolences while pouring glasses of expensive scotch. Carter was boasting about his fictional business ventures, feeling secure in his stolen inheritance. They were comfortable. They were arrogant. They were entirely oblivious to the ticking clock. I leaned my head against the cold window pane and thought about my grandfather. Theodore had engineered this exact scenario. He knew his daughter possessed a bottomless capacity for greed, but he also understood her tactical impatience. He predicted she would attempt a preemptive strike the moment his heart stopped beating. He foresaw this gathering, this accusation, this precise sequence of events. He had trained me to endure the discomfort of silence. He taught me that true power does not require an audience. It only requires leverage. I monitored the digital clock on my dashboard. 3:58 in the afternoon. The winter twilight was beginning to dim the sky, turning the clouds a bruised shade of purple. The gravel at the end of the long driveway crunched beneath heavy tires. A sleek black town car turned off the main road and glided onto the property. The vehicle moved with a smooth, predatory grace, bypassing the clustered sedans and luxury sport utility vehicles parked haphazardly by my relatives. It pulled to a stop directly behind my car, blocking the exit lane. The engine cut off. The driver door opened. Elias Thorne stepped out onto the frozen driveway. He wore a heavy wool overcoat over his tailored suit. His silver hair remained perfectly combed despite the biting wind. He did not look at my car. He did not offer a nod of acknowledgement. Our coordination required no visible communication. Elias reached into the back seat of the town car and retrieved a thick leather-bound ledger. The book held the compiled financial records of a 30-year relationship between an accountant and an economics professor. He closed the car door with a solid, authoritative thud. He adjusted his grip on the ledger, turned his shoulders square to the estate, and began walking toward the front door. I watched Elias Thorne ascend the granite steps of the Concord estate. He did not bother to ring the doorbell. He possessed an original brass key provided by my grandfather months prior during our covert meetings in the study. Elias turned the lock and stepped inside the foyer. I rolled down the window of my sedan just enough to let the freezing air circulate and to capture the muffled sounds emanating from the house. The heavy oak door remained slightly ajar behind him. I could hear the distinct clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of congratulatory chatter. The family had migrated from the formal living room into the adjacent dining hall. They were pouring expensive scotch and celebrating their presumed inheritance. Elias walked down the corridor with the steady, measured pace of a man who dictates the terms of reality. He is a 60-year-old Boston Brahmin. His lineage traces back to the textile mills of the 19th century and the original banking institutions of New England. Men like Elias do not climb social ladders because their ancestors built the scaffolding. He operates with a rigid adherence to fiduciary duty. He is entirely immune to the performative elitism my mother weaponizes. Social maneuvering holds no value to an auditor who measures human worth in verified ledgers and tax compliance. Elias paused at the threshold of the dining room. Carter was standing near the limestone fireplace, holding a tumbler of amber liquid. My brother was holding court loudly, boasting about the future expansion of his fictitious technology startup. Sylvia was seated at the head of the long table, accepting compliments on her stoic handling of a difficult family matter. She basked in the validation of the assembled academics and surgeons. Elias did not clear his throat to request attention. He simply spoke. His voice resonated with cold baritone authority, demanding that everyone in the room remain seated and cease talking. The laughter died instantly. A cousin who had been mid-sentence snapped his mouth shut. The sudden silence was profound. Sylvia stood up, smoothing the front of her black cashmere sweater. Her face tightened into a rigid mask of polite condescension. She assumed Elias was arriving prematurely to discuss the routine probate process or schedule a reading of a standard will. She offered a tight, thin smile intended to project dominance. She attempted to dismiss him in front of the audience. She stated his presence was unnecessary today because the family had already handled the internal theft. She claimed the financial discrepancies were resolved, and the primary offender had been permanently exiled from the premises. She instructed Elias to return to his office and wait for her formal instructions on Monday morning. Elias did not acknowledge her narrative. He ignored her directive entirely. He walked directly toward the center of the dining hall. The relatives parted to let him through, instinctively yielding to the physical manifestation of institutional power. He carried the thick leather-bound ledger in his right hand. He stopped at the mahogany dining table, clearing a space between a platter of artisan cheeses and a stack of folded linen napkins. He raised the heavy ledger and let it drop flat onto the polished wood. The impact produced a resounding sharp thud that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. It was the sound of a judge striking a wooden block. The noise severed whatever lingering arrogance remained in the room. Sylvia visibly flinched. Carter lowered his scotch glass, sloshing the liquid over his knuckles. The physical weight of the book commanded the space. Elias rested both hands on the dark leather cover. He looked around the room, establishing prolonged eye contact with the university deans, the medical professionals, and the regional historians. He allowed the tension to stretch, testing their cultivated composure and finding it fragile. Sylvia tried to regain control of the narrative. She stepped away from the head of the table and reminded Elias that she was the next of kin. She reiterated her expectation that the distribution of assets would proceed under her explicit direction. Elias looked at her with an expression of pure clinical pity. He informed the room that his role extended far beyond mere accounting and tax preparation. He announced he was not a simple consultant awaiting orders. He stated he was the legally appointed executor of an irrevocable blind trust. The legal terminology landed like physical blows across the room. Irrevocable, blind, trust. The academics in the room understood the implications immediately. Massachusetts trust law is notoriously rigid. My uncle shifted in his chair, his posture shrinking as the reality set in. A murmur rippled through the seated guests as they realized the wealth they had spent in their minds was no longer subject to probate court. It was sealed, protected, and managed by the man standing before them. The power dynamic inverted in a matter of seconds. The bureaucratic guillotine was officially raised over the dining table. Sylvia stepped back, her heel catching the edge of the Persian rug. She stammered, attempting to formulate a coherent response, but the parameters of her reality were rapidly collapsing. She demanded to see the legal paperwork, claiming Theodore lacked the mental capacity to execute such a complex financial instrument. Elias did not offer her a moment to recover or pivot her strategy. He projected his voice so every relative in the dining hall could hear the precise details of her failure. He revealed that 3 years ago, long before the ischemic stroke restricted his mobility, Theodore ordered a comprehensive shadow audit of the estate. My grandfather had detected financial anomalies on his own. Theodore retained Elias to quietly track every unauthorized withdrawal every forged signature, and every liquidated physical asset without alerting the perpetrators. Elias explained that this leather-bound ledger contained the pristine, unalterable timeline of true events. He grasped the cover of the heavy book. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with printed spreadsheets, notarized bank statements, and high-resolution photographs of pawnshop receipts. The meticulously gathered evidence stared back at the assembled family. Elias turned past the initial index and located a specific page near the beginning of the volume. He placed his index finger on a line item detailing a wire transfer originating from the pension account belonging to Theodore. It was the very first transaction Sylvia thought she had executed in total secrecy. She had used those funds to pay the deposit on the luxury apartment Carter leased in Cambridge. Elias stood there, his finger anchoring the undeniable proof of her crime to the mahogany table. He read the date, the routing number, and the exact dollar amount aloud. The room descended into a suffocating paralysis. The aunts and uncles who had texted me venomous insults just an hour prior now stared at Sylvia with wide eyes. Carter backed away from the fireplace, his face draining of color. Sylvia stood frozen, her mouth open, but unable to produce a sound. Elias remained perfectly still, holding his finger on the ledger, leaving the antagonists entirely trapped in the glaring light of their own arrogance. I stepped out of the sedan. The winter wind whipped across the frozen driveway, but I barely registered the dropping temperature. I walked silently across the gravel and ascended the granite steps. The heavy oak door remained slightly ajar, exactly as Elias had left it. I slipped into the shadowed foyer. I did not announce my presence. I stood beside the grandfather clock, letting its mechanical rhythm anchor my pulse. From this vantage point, I held a clear, unobstructed view of the dining hall. The trap was springing, and I wanted to observe the mechanics of the mechanism. Elias Thorne did not elevate his volume to compete with the ambient tension. He lowered his baritone voice, forcing the room to lean forward. He turned the heavy parchment page of the ledger. October 14th. Elias read, 1400 hours. A wire transfer initiated from a desktop computer located within this residence. He recited the specific Internet Protocol address. He matched the sequence of numbers to the machine sitting in Sylvia's private upstairs study. Amount $12,500, Elias stated. Destination: a commercial checking account registered to a technology venture in the Seaport district. Carter shifted his weight. His tailored morning suit suddenly looked like a cheap theatrical costume. Elias did not pause to let the golden child recover his equilibrium. He flipped another page. The crisp sound of turning paper echoed off the vaulted ceiling. November 2nd, Elias continued. He produced a clear plastic sleeve containing a high-resolution photograph of a thermal receipt. He passed the transparent folder to my uncle, the university dean, who sat closest to the mahogany table. The liquidation of physical household assets, Elias said. Antique sterling silver flatware. The payout was $4,200 provided by a licensed broker in Back Bay. My uncle adjusted his reading glasses. He studied the document, tracing the lines of ink. He looked up and locked eyes with Carter. "This is your signature," my uncle stated. It was not a question, it was a formal academic indictment. Sylvia could not tolerate the shifting tide. Control constituted her primary currency, and her accounts were bankrupt. She lunged forward, placing both hands on the table. "This is a fabrication," she shouted. Her voice bounced across the dining room, shrill and desperate. Theodore was confused in his final years. Elias is manipulating the records to steal the estate for himself. Winifred put him up to this. My daughter is a pathological liar. She expected the room to rally behind her. She expected the prestige of her social standing to override the printed spreadsheets. She severely miscalculated the cultural currency of our Massachusetts lineage. We are a family of researchers, diagnosticians, and historians. We bow to empirical evidence. Emotional outbursts hold no weight against verifiable data. My aunt, a senior tenured professor of sociology, crossed her arms. "Be quiet, Sylvia," she commanded. The blunt instruction hung in the frigid air. Sylvia blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She looked around the table, searching for a single sympathetic face. She found none. "Sit down and let the man read the data," my uncle added. His tone carried profound clinical disgust. They did not care about Sylvia experiencing emotional distress. They cared about the integrity of the ledger. They realized they had been weaponized against an innocent target just 2 hours prior. Their intellectual pride was wounded, and they demanded the truth to rectify the error. Sylvia collapsed back into her chair. The fight drained from her posture. Elias resumed his staccato delivery. He targeted the exact figures Sylvia had projected onto the screen during her theatrical living room presentation. "You claimed a sum of $140,000 was siphoned over 24 months. Elias stated, his gaze fixed on my mother. "Your arithmetic was remarkably precise. Your attribution, however, was fraudulent." He turned another page. He read a sequence of routing numbers corresponding to Theodore Primary Pension Fund. He documented 12 distinct transfers. He correlated every single transaction to Sylvia's personal banking credentials. He demonstrated how she authenticated the transfers using Theodore's date of birth and social security number. He tracked the capital as it flowed through her accounts and deposited directly into Carter, mounting debts. "May 5th, Elias articulated. $3,800 transferred to a luxury automotive leasing company in Cambridge." He listed the merchant codes for each purchase: high-end steakhouses, tailored clothing boutiques, European airlines. He dismantled the presentation slide by slide. The $50,000 home equity line of credit Sylvia had pinned on my student debt was exposed as the primary funding source for Carter's fictitious software development company. The financial data acted as a surgical scalpel, flaying her carefully constructed facade down to the bone. Elias did not use adjectives. He did not describe her actions as evil or sinister. He merely presented the chronological progression of her theft. The absence of emotional language rendered the presentation devastating. Facts offer no surface area for an argument. You cannot debate a routing number. You cannot gaslight a timestamp. Elias pulled a stack of bank statements from the back pocket of the ledger. He distributed copies down the length of the dining table. The relatives passed the papers in silence. The rustle of paper replaced the celebratory clinking of crystal glasses. The cousin who managed the surgical practice ran her finger down the column of withdrawals. She traced the flow of capital from Theodore Life Savings straight into Carter's pocket. "She funded your entire existence," the cousin whispered, looking at Carter. Carter stared at his polished leather shoes, unable to mount a single syllable of defense. The illusion of his academic brilliance shattered into microscopic fragments. He was not a scholar. He was a parasite documented in black and white ink. His networking dinners and bespoke suits were purchased with stolen equity. Sylvia attempted one final maneuver. She tried to cry. She forced tears into her eyes and reached out toward her brother, the dean. "I was protecting my son," she whimpered, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "Theodore wanted Carter to succeed. I was simply executing his unspoken wishes. A mother does whatever she must to support her child." Elias snapped the ledger shut. The sharp noise severed her fabricated tears. "Theodore's wishes were explicitly documented," Elias countered. "He instructed me to audit every cent you misappropriated. He watched you liquidate his legacy to fund a delusion." Elias placed both hands flat on the leather cover. He had dismantled her narrative without raising his heart rate. The $140,000 was accounted for down to the final decimal. The ledger of truth had annihilated her credibility. She sat in the ruin of her own design, exposed before the only audience she ever truly valued. The relatives stared at her, recognizing the predator hiding beneath the cashmere sweater. The room waited for the final judgment. The dining room of the conquered estate remained locked in a suffocating quiet. Elias Thorne stood at the head of the mahogany table, his hands resting on the leather ledger. He had successfully dismantled my mother's fabricated narrative regarding the missing silver and the depleted pension accounts. Civil theft constituted a severe breach of fiduciary duty, but Elias was preparing to transition the prosecution to an entirely different jurisdiction. He was moving from familial betrayal to federal crime. He turned a heavy parchment page near the center of the book. The crisp sound of the paper shifting drew the attention of every relative in the room. Sylvia sat frozen in her chair. The cashmere sweater she wore suddenly looked heavy and restrictive. She watched Elias with the wide, unblinking stare of a prey animal recognizing the predator in the grass. Elias addressed the $50,000 home equity line of credit. 2 hours prior, Sylvia had projected a spreadsheet onto a screen, claiming I originated this loan to cover my fictitious student debt. Elias presented the physical loan origination document. He slid a high-resolution photocopy across the polished wood toward my uncle, the university dean. The document displayed my printed name and my supposed signature securing the loan against Theodore property. Sylvia exhaled a sharp breath. She attempted to regain a foothold in the conversation. She stated the signature on the document matched my handwriting. She claimed I executed the paperwork online and requested the funds be routed through her accounts for convenience. Her voice lacked the theatrical resonance it carried earlier. It was thin and reedy. Elias did not engage with her desperate pivot. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a bound manila folder. He opened the folder and extracted a 20-page technical report. He explained that Theodore did not rely on layman observations to verify financial documents. 6 months before his passing, my grandfather commissioned a board-certified forensic document examiner to analyze the loan application. Theodore obtained writing samples from every member of this family, Elias informed the room. He provided the examiner with birthday cards, grocery lists, and canceled checks. The examiner analyzed the loan signature using microscopic evaluation and biometric measurement. Elias read the executive summary of the forensic report. The analysis detailed the specific biomechanics of the forged signature. The examiner noted the pen pressure, the slant of the ascenders, and the spatial relationship between the letters. The report concluded with zero margin for error that I did not sign the document. The signature was a precise biomechanical match to Sylvia. She had attempted to mimic my handwriting but failed to suppress her own ingrained muscle memory. My uncle read the forensic conclusion over Elias' shoulder. He looked at Sylvia. The disgust on his face deepened into something resembling horror. Stealing liquid cash from an aging parent was a moral failing. Forging a legal banking instrument using the identity of your own daughter crossed a definitive legal threshold. Elias explained the jurisdictional severity of her actions. By executing the fraudulent loan online and transferring the capital across state banking networks, Sylvia engaged in wire fraud. By using my social security number to secure the equity, she committed aggravated identity theft. These were not civil matters to be resolved in probate court. These were felony offenses carrying mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. Carter stood near the fireplace. His bespoke morning suit hung awkwardly on his frame. He had remained silent during the systematic destruction of his mother. He assumed the financial crimes belonged solely to her. He believed his status as the passive recipient shielded him from consequence. Elias corrected this misconception with surgical efficiency. Elias reached into the back pocket of the leather ledger. He produced a single sheet of standard printer paper. He walked away from the head of the table. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as he approached my brother. Elias stopped 2 feet away from Carter. He held the piece of paper out. Carter hesitated. His eyes darted toward the exit, then back to the accountant. He raised his hand and took the paper. Elias informed the room that the paper contained the text of Title 18 United States Code Section 1343. It was the federal statute defining wire fraud and conspiracy. You received the stolen capital, Elias told my brother. Your signature is on the pawn shop receipts. You utilized the forged credit line to sign the commercial lease for your technology venture in the Seaport District. Ignorance of the origin is not a viable defense when the paper trail deposits the felony directly into your checking account. You are an active co-conspirator. Carter physically recoiled. He took a stumbling step backward. His shoulders hit the limestone mantel of the fireplace. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale hue. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The money he spent on vintage wristwatches and networking dinners was now toxic waste. Every dollar he accepted from Sylvia was a potential indictment. Sylvia found her voice. Panic stripped away her aristocratic veneer. She demanded to know why Theodore did not simply call the police. She asked why her father allowed her to continue transferring the funds if he possessed the forensic proof of her crimes. She viewed the trap as a cruelty. She could not comprehend why he let her walk so far onto the ice before pointing out the cracks. Theodore despised the inefficiency of the criminal justice system, Elias replied, returning to his position at the table. He viewed a public trial as a waste of resources and a permanent stain on the family legacy. Sending his own daughter and grandson to a federal penitentiary would only generate gossip and legal fees. Theodore did not want vengeance. He wanted absolute unyielding leverage. Elias closed the leather ledger. He rested his hands on the cover. He delivered the final ultimatum with chilling clarity. The legal architecture Theodore designed functions as a dead man's switch, Elias stated. You have a choice, Sylvia. You and Carter will walk out of this house today. You will not request a single piece of furniture. You will not petition the probate court. You will accept your total disinheritance in complete silence. If you abide by these terms, this ledger and the forensic analysis remain permanently sealed inside my vault. Elias paused, allowing the escape route to materialize in their minds before sealing the alternate path. However, if you attempt to claim a single cent of this estate, Elias continued, his voice dropping an octave, if you retain legal counsel to challenge the blind trust, if you utter one word of protest regarding the distribution of assets my fiduciary duty activates, I am under strict legally binding instructions to submit this entire volume to the Financial Crimes Division of the Massachusetts Attorney General. The trap snapped shut. The mechanical precision of the design was flawless. Sylvia and Carter were staring at a binary outcome. They could choose poverty or they could choose prison. There was no negotiation. There was no middle ground. The wealth they believed they secured was a mirage masking a bear trap. Sylvia stared at the closed ledger. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. The reality of her situation crushed the remaining defiance from her posture. She was not merely disinherited. She was a hostage to her own greed. If she moved, she died. Carter crumpled the printed statute in his fist, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The golden child was realizing his pristine academic facade was tethered to a ticking bomb. The assembled relatives sat in stunned silence. They had gathered to watch an execution. They had cheered when Sylvia placed my head on the chopping block. Now they realized they were witnessing a calculated, controlled demolition of the two people they had elevated above me for decades. The power dynamic in the room had permanently inverted. The silence was absolute. The ledger sat on the table holding the weight of their destruction. Elias stepped back, folding his hands, awaiting their submission. Elias Thorne did not retreat from the mahogany table after delivering the ultimatum regarding the federal wire fraud statutes. He had secured Sylvia in a psychological vice, but his fiduciary mandate was not yet complete. The accountant shifted his attention toward the limestone fireplace. Carter stood there clutching the printed legal code. My brother believed the worst was over. He assumed his punishment consisted solely of losing his future inheritance and enduring a few moments of profound public embarrassment. He fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of our grandfather and his retribution. The collateral damage was designed to target the exact foundation of my brother and his constructed identity. For 8 years, Carter had cultivated an image of intellectual superiority. He navigated the elite academic circles of Boston by claiming his doctoral research was funded by highly competitive university fellowships. He attended regattas and faculty mixers, projecting the aura of a brilliant historian recognized by prestigious institutional boards. He wore bespoke tweed jackets and spoke at length about his dissertation on 19th-century European trade routes. Elias systematically dismantled this fiction. The accountant opened a secondary folder resting beneath the primary ledger. He retrieved a stack of banking statements printed on heavy bond paper. He distributed them to my uncle and the assembled relatives. The documents traced a direct line from Theodore and his individual retirement accounts to a series of shell deposits. The money bypassed standard educational channels entirely and landed directly in the personal checking account belonging to Carter. The prestigious fellowships were a complete fabrication. Sylvia had laundered the stolen equity to manufacture a fake academic pedigree for her son. The relatives scrutinized the bank transfers. My uncle, who served as a university dean, turned pale. In the rigid culture of Massachusetts, higher education funding discrepancies are viewed with intense suspicion. Outright financial deception is an unforgivable offense. Elias delivered the fatal blow with the detached precision of a surgeon excising infected tissue. He informed the room that Theodore did not merely document the theft for criminal leverage. My grandfather abhorred academic dishonesty above all other moral failings. 2 weeks before his ischemic stroke, Theodore compiled a comprehensive dossier. He gathered the falsified financial aid applications Carter had submitted to his university. My brother had repeatedly filed federal student aid forms claiming zero external income while simultaneously receiving thousands of dollars in stolen capital from his mother. Theodore packaged the fraudulent applications alongside the corresponding bank wire receipts. He mailed the entire dossier via certified courier directly to the ethics board of the university. Elias produced the certified mail receipt and placed it on the dining table. He stated that the ethics board had already convened a preliminary hearing. The heir left the dining room. Carter dropped the printed federal statute onto the Persian rug. The paper landed without a sound. In our specific social stratum, an individual can survive a divorce or a bankruptcy. You cannot survive an ethics board expulsion for financial fraud. His doctoral candidacy was vaporized. The university would revoke his standing demand immediate repayment of any legitimate institutional funds and blacklist him from every credible academic institution in the country. The 8 years Carter spent cultivating advisors and attending networking dinners dissolved into absolute ruin. He was 31 years old with no degree, no legitimate work history, and a permanent digital record of institutional fraud. The identity he built on intellectual superiority and elitism crumbled in front of his aunts and uncles. He was exposed as a dependent fraud who consumed the resources of a dying man to fund a charade. The facade of the loyal, supportive son shattered. The golden child stripped of his armor revealed the coward hiding underneath. Carter did not accept responsibility for signing the pawnshop receipts or spending the forged loan money. He pivoted his panic outward. He looked at Sylvia, the woman who had sacrificed her own freedom and compromised her soul to fund his delusion, was sitting paralyzed in her chair. Carter took a step toward her, his face contorted into a mask of pure selfish rage. He yelled that she had ruined him. The sound echoed harshly against the vaulted ceiling, breaking the stoic silence that had governed the household for decades. He stated that she told him the money was clean. He claimed he trusted her to handle the logistics and she had turned him into a criminal. Sylvia stared up at her son. Her eyes widened in shock. She had engineered a felony to protect his fragile ego, and he was offering her to the wolves to save his own skin. Carter continued his verbal assault, his voice cracking under the weight of his collapsing reality. He declared that he needed that funding to finish his dissertation. He reminded her that she promised him the resources to succeed. He blamed her for enabling the entire situation. He accused her of handing him stolen cash and telling him he deserved it. He screamed that she had destroyed his life. The relatives watched the implosion with clinical fascination. The symbiotic relationship between the narcissist and the enabler was eating itself alive. They were tearing each other apart in front of the very audience they had desperately tried to impress. The loyalty they projected during the living room presentation was exposed as a brittle alliance built on mutual greed. When the consequences arrived, they immediately turned on one another. I did not witness this confrontation from a seat at the mahogany table. I remained outside the blast radius. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan parked near the exit of the circular driveway. The engine was off. The winter cold seeped through the glass, chilling the interior of the cabin. I kept my hands folded in my lap. My resting heart rate remained steady. Through the windshield, I observed the grand colonial estate. The warm yellow light glowing from the dining room windows illuminated the chaos unfolding inside. I watched the shadows project against the drawn curtains. I saw the silhouette of Elias Thorne standing tall and immovable like a granite monument. I watched the shadow of my brother gesture frantically, pacing back and forth, waving his arms in a desperate pantomime of betrayal. I saw the hunched outline of my mother sinking lower into her chair, crushed by the weight of her own architectural collapse. I was entirely removed from the destruction. I felt no urge to march inside and claim victory. I did not need to witness their tears or hear their frantic apologies. The data had been successfully delivered. The variables were resolving exactly as the mathematical model predicted. Theodore had taught me well. We had built a perfect containment unit. We loaded it with the undeniable truth and handed the detonator to an impartial accountant. My presence inside that room would have only provided them with a target for their misplaced anger. By removing myself from the physical environment, I forced them to face the pure, unfiltered consequences of their own actions. They could not blame me for the forged signature. They could not blame me for the fake fellowships. They could not blame me for the ethics board investigation. I sat in the freezing car, analyzing the geometry of the shadows on the glass. The grand estate looked stark and resolute against the dark purple sky of the Massachusetts winter. The chaos inside was contained, trapped within the walls of the dining room. I watched the shadows continue their frantic dance, waiting patiently for Elias to conclude the proceedings and exit the house. The narrative was nearing its final resolution, and the ultimate transfer of power was about to commence. I remained in the driver's seat of my sedan. The winter wind howled against the chassis, pushing bitter drafts through the microscopic gaps in the weather stripping. Through the slightly lowered window, I could hear the resonance of Elias Thorne concluding his mandate. He had reduced my mother and my brother to ash using their own financial footprints. Now he needed to sweep the floor and pour the concrete for the new foundation. Elias retrieved a secondary document from his leather briefcase. This paper lacked the dense financial spreadsheets of the punitive ledger. It bore the embossed seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Elias announced the final allocation of Theodore and his legacy. He read the preamble establishing that my grandfather possessed a sound mind and a clear intent at the time of drafting. He did not rush the delivery. He ensured every syllable carried the weight of legal finality. Then he delivered this distribution of assets. To my daughter Sylvia, I leave the sum of $0. To my grandson Carter, I leave the sum of $0. The blunt arithmetic hung in the dining room. There was no softening language. There were no platitudes about love or enduring familial bonds. Theodore spoke through the document with the clinical precision of an economist terminating a toxic investment. He recognized that leaving them even a nominal sum would provide them with a foothold to contest the document. He severed them entirely from the capital flow. Elias explained the destination of the remaining wealth. The conquered property, the accumulated liquid capital, and the extensive historical archives were bound into an irrevocable blind trust. The historical archives represented generations of regional history, curated by Theodore over 5 decades. The collection included original correspondence from early colonial governors, rare cartographic surveys, and first-edition literary manuscripts. The archives held immense academic and monetary value. Sylvia had planned to donate a fraction of them to a prominent historical society to purchase a board seat for herself. Carter had intended to sell the rarest volumes to private collectors to fund his tailored suits and phantom technology startup. Theodore barricaded all of it behind a wall of legal iron. Elias articulated the exact parameters of the trust. The structure was designed to govern the estate in perpetuity. He stated the designated sole beneficiary and controlling trustee was Winifred Prescott. The impact of that statement radiated through the dining room walls and reached me in the freezing driveway. The shadows cast upon the drawn curtains froze. The relatives understood the magnitude of this structural shift. Theodore had not merely bypassed his daughter, he had crowned the family outcast as the unquestioned sovereign of the Prescott lineage. The daughter who paid her own tuition, the scientist who worked 60-hour laboratory shifts, the control group of the family experiment, now held the keys to the entire empire. Elias did not let the shock dissipate before enforcing the perimeter. He read the penalty clause. The trust featured a severe no-contest provision. If Sylvia or Carter attempted to petition the probate court challenge my authority or extract a single cent from the holdings, the fiduciary mandate would automatically trigger. Elias stated he would immediately forward the digital ledger, the forensic handwriting analysis, and the certified bank receipts to the federal authorities. The legal barrier was impenetrable. If they tried to break the trust to satiate their greed, they would purchase their own prison sentences. The extortion was flawless because it relied entirely on their self-preservation. My smartphone rested on the passenger seat. The screen illuminated the dark cabin. The notifications began to arrive in rapid succession. The dynamic inside the house had fractured and reorganized. The aunts and uncles who had condemned me 2 hours earlier suddenly discovered their diplomatic skills. They realized I now controlled the wealth, the property, and the prestigious archives they all coveted. The academic elite of Massachusetts possess a remarkable ability to pivot their moral compass when funding is on the line. My uncle, the university dean, texted a lengthy paragraph praising my stoic grace. He claimed he always knew Theodore recognized my intellectual rigor. He suggested we meet for coffee to discuss the curation of the historical texts for his university library. A cousin sent a message expressing her profound relief that the estate was in capable analytical hands. Another relative apologized for the earlier misunderstanding, blaming Sylvia for manipulating the narrative and misleading the family. I watched the messages scroll across the glass screen. I did not reply. I locked the device and placed it face down on the upholstery. I felt a surge of cold, clinical disgust. This was the new conflict. I was no longer the designated scapegoat. I was the warden. They were desperate to secure favorable treatment. They were cowards. Their social integrity was a hollow shell painted with academic prestige. They bowed to whoever held the checkbook. I realized I would have to manage their sycophancy with the same strict, unyielding boundaries I used to manage their disdain. The data set had changed, but the subjects remained just as flawed. The front door of the estate opened. A rectangle of warm yellow light spilled onto the frozen granite porch. Elias emerged into the winter evening. He closed the heavy oak door, sealing the panic and the groveling inside. He descended the stone steps with the measured pace of a man who had executed a flawless operation. He walked across the gravel driveway. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, but his posture remained rigid and unaffected. He approached my sedan. He stood beside the driver's side door, waiting patiently. I pressed the button to lower the window. The frigid air flooded the cabin, mixing with the heat radiating from the vents. Elias did not offer a celebratory grin. We do not celebrate gravity for pulling an apple to the earth. We merely acknowledge the physics. The math had simply resolved according to the formula we built. He reached into the pocket of his tailored wool overcoat. He withdrew a heavy brass ring. The ring held 3 archaic skeleton keys for the original doors of the Concord estate and a modern security fob for the upgraded alarm system. He reached through the open window and placed the cold metal into my open palm. The weight of the keys settled against my skin. Next, he retrieved a sealed parchment envelope. The paper bore the distinct angular handwriting of my grandfather. My name was inscribed across the front in dark ink. Elias handed me the letter. He informed me that his fiduciary duty regarding the reading was complete. He stated that the house was mine. The accounts were mine. The narrative was mine to control. He advised me to change the alarm codes before midnight to ensure Sylvia could not attempt a final desperate extraction. I nodded. I thanked him for his precision and his unwavering adherence to the truth. Elias turned and walked toward his waiting town car. I sat in the freezing sedan holding the brass ring. I curled my fingers around the keys. The sharp edges of the metal pressed into my palm, grounding me in the physical reality of the moment. It was the physical weight of empirical justice. The quiet, calculated victory was secured. I looked at the sealed letter resting on my lap, knowing it held the final variable in my grandfather and his equation. I prepared to read the final words of the man who taught me how to build a fortress out of facts. I broke the wax seal on the parchment envelope. The ambient glow from the dashboard illuminated my grandfather and his angular handwriting. The letter contained 3 brief sentences. Winifred, you are the only variable in this family capable of remaining constant. Guard the estate and do not let sentiment compromise your logic. I leave you the authority to close the equation. I folded the heavy paper and slid it into the inner pocket of my peacoat. The physical weight of his trust settled into my chest. I opened the car door and stepped out into the freezing night. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the front entrance of the Concord property. The heavy oak door yielded easily to the brass key Elias had just provided. I crossed the threshold and entered the foyer. The environment inside the house had undergone a profound inversion. 2 hours prior, this space functioned as an auditorium for my public execution. My relatives had gathered to witness my mother deliver a fabricated indictment. Now the residence resembled the aftermath of a localized natural disaster. The extended family members had scattered. My aunts and uncles fled the premises the moment Elias concluded his presentation, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of my mother and her crimes. Only Sylvia and Carter remained in the mahogany-paneled living room. The digital projector sat powered down on the coffee table. The projection screen was blank, reflecting nothing. Sylvia sat collapsed on the Persian rug. The pristine black cashmere sweater she wore was wrinkled and covered in lint. Her face was flushed and marked with dark streaks of ruined makeup. She was weeping. The sounds emanating from her throat were ragged and desperate. Carter stood in the far corner of the room, staring blankly at the wall. The bespoke morning suit he purchased with stolen equity hung off his frame like a discarded shell. The academic fraud was paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his unearned prestige. His fraudulent university career and his fictional technology startup were reduced to ash. I walked into the center of the room. My footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor. Sylvia looked up at me. Her eyes widened, searching my face for a trace of the submissive daughter she used to manipulate. She pushed herself off the floor and stumbled forward. She reached out her hands, trembling, and attempted to grasp my arm. "Winifred, please!" Sylvia sobbed, her voice hoarse and unstable. "You cannot do this to us. You must understand the pressure I was under. Family is family. We share the same blood. We can fix this together." I stepped back out of her reach. I did not raise my voice or mirror her erratic energy. I evaluated her plea with the clinical precision of a biostatistician confronting a corrupted dataset. "Blood is a biological mechanism for transporting oxygen, Sylvia." I stated, my tone flat and unyielding. "It does not excuse wire fraud or identity theft. Your definition of family requires my perpetual submission to your financial extraction. I am terminating that arrangement." Carter turned away from the wall. He opened his mouth, attempting to formulate a defense, but no sound emerged. He was realizing that his entire existence depended on a host that had just deployed an impenetrable immune response. He had spent 8 years pretending to be a brilliant scholar while his mother drained a dying man to fund his leased luxury vehicles and tailored clothing. Now the funding was severed, and his true nature was exposed to the harsh light. I addressed them both, delivering the final parameters of their eviction. "I am the sole controlling trustee of this estate," I explained. "You have exactly 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate this property. You will not remove a single piece of furniture, a single book from the historical archives, or any item purchased with Theodore and his capital. If you attempt to steal a single silver spoon, I will notify the authorities." Sylvia gasped, pressing her hands to her chest. She begged me not to send them to federal prison. She offered to write an apology letter to the University Ethics Board to save Carter and his academic standing. She promised to repay the stolen funds using her own salary, knowing full well her income could never cover the deficit. "I will not press criminal charges," I replied. I watched the brief flicker of relief wash over her face before I extinguished it. "Do not confuse this decision with mercy. A federal trial requires depositions, witness testimonies, and months of legal coordination. Prosecuting you would be an inefficient use of my time and resources. I prefer to excise the tumor and move forward without looking back. Your punishment is the total collapse of the false reality you constructed. You will have to live the rest of your lives knowing everyone in your social circle recognizes you as thieves." I retrieved my smartphone from my pocket. I unlocked the screen and navigated to my contact list. I held the device up so Sylvia and Carter could see the glowing interface. I selected my mother and her name. I tapped the icon to block her number. I repeated the exact process for my brother. "Your access to my life is permanently revoked," I stated. "The dataset is closed." I turned and walked out of the living room, leaving them to the quiet devastation of their own making. There was no tearful embrace. There was no forced reconciliation or lingering emotional debate. The equation had balanced itself, leaving a zero-variance outcome. The toxic elements were isolated and neutralized. Monday morning arrived with crisp sunlight illuminating the skyline of Cambridge. I entered my laboratory at 7 o'clock wearing a clean white coat. The hum of the ventilation system provided a steady, rhythmic background noise. The stainless steel counters gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The environment was sterile, secure, and entirely under my jurisdiction. I sat at my workstation and opened my primary analytical software. The data from the Phase 3 clinical trial populated my dual monitors. I ran a fresh diagnostic sweep, identifying the statistical anomalies that had troubled me last week. I isolated the flawed variables and removed the corrupted inputs. The scatter plot regenerated, aligning into a perfect, pristine curve. The numbers were honest. The baseline was restored. I reviewed the final readouts with a profound sense of tranquility. I had spent 34 years existing as the control group in a toxic familial experiment, observing the extraction of resources and the manipulation of truth. That study was officially terminated. I adjusted the parameters of my own life, ensuring the data remained clean, the variables stayed controlled, and my future proceeded entirely free of the anomalies that once tried to destroy me.
There is a profound silence that settles over a house when the truth is finally spoken out loud. It is not the silence of peace, but the heavy, ringing quiet that follows the collapse of a long-standing illusion. The story of the Prescott family is more than just a drama played out in a mahogany-paneled living room. It is a mirror held up to the very fabric of American family culture, reflecting the quiet crises occurring at dinner tables across the country. As we dissect the ruins of their estate, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about parenting legacy and the true cost of blind devotion. At the heart of the Prescott family collapse is a disease that infects countless households, the devastation of favoritism and the golden child syndrome. In American culture, we often equate endless provision with love. Sylvia believed that by funding Carter's entire existence, his luxury apartment, his leased car, his expensive networking dinners, she was securing his success. Instead, she was building a golden cage. When parents meticulously clear every obstacle from their child's path and remove all survival pressure, they do not create exceptional scholars or resilient adults. They cultivate dependents who harbor delusions of grandeur. By removing the struggle, Sylvia stripped her son of the very friction required to build character, ultimately leaving him incapable of standing on his own when he stepped into the real world. Conversely, look at the daughter who was cast aside. Cut off from the family's financial reservoir, Winifred was forced into the crucible of reality. Working 60 hours a week in a laboratory fighting for research grants and enduring sleepless nights did not break her. It forged her. This is the paradox of adversity. The self-reliance and resilience she developed represent the true core of American grit. Parents must realize that shielding a child from hardship often steals their opportunity to discover their own strength. Blind inheritance is a curse. Hard-won independence is a lifelong asset. Raising children within a traditional family structure demands a profound level of emotional awareness. Sylvia lacked the introspection required to see that her actions were driven not by genuine love, but by her own fragile ego. She needed a successful son to validate her standing in society. When parents lack emotional awareness, they project their unfulfilled desires onto their children, warping the child's sense of self. A parent's duty is to see their child clearly, flaws, strengths, and limitations included, and to guide them fairly. Fairness does not mean the equal distribution of resources regardless of behavior. Fairness means holding everyone to the same standard of honesty and accountability. This dynamic is deeply intertwined with a uniquely American obsession, the illusion of prestige. In a culture that highly values intellectual rigor and academic achievement, families can easily twist these ideals into a hollow pursuit of elitism. Sylvia and Carter prioritize the appearance of success over the substance of hard work. We are reminded that a degree does not define a person's character. True value resides in the integrity of one's labor, not in flashy titles, fake internships, or superficial social connections. Grandfather Theodore embodied a different vital breed of traditional values. He respected empirical truth, logic, and discipline. His silent observation of his family serves as a harsh lesson for all parents. Loving your children does not mean tolerating their deceit. Yet the most terrifying lesson from the Prescott estate is how easily misguided parental love can curdle into complicity. Sylvia's devotion to Carter blinded her to his incompetence, leading her down a dark path of wire fraud and identity theft. When a parent attempts to mask a child's failures through financial manipulation, and by tearing down other family members, they are not protecting their child. They are constructing a ticking time bomb. Guiding a child's future must be rooted in an honest assessment of their actual abilities and moral compass, not in forcing them to wear the heavy, suffocating coat of a parent's false expectations. To enable a child to the point of criminality is the ultimate failure of guardianship. If these themes resonate with the unspoken dynamics in your own life, or if you have ever sat at a family gathering and recognized the invisible strings of favoritism and manipulation, take a moment to subscribe to Orange Vengeance. We are building a community dedicated to dissecting these complex familial narratives, exposing the truth behind closed doors, and finding empowerment in setting firm boundaries. Hit the follow button, and let's continue to explore the architecture of justice together. Ultimately, this saga challenges us to redefine what we mean by traditional family culture. For too long, the phrase "family is family" has been weaponized. It has been used as an impenetrable shield to excuse emotional abuse, financial theft, and profound disrespect. But shared blood is merely a biological fact. It is not a free pass for toxic behavior. Respecting family traditions does not mean closing our eyes to their sins. Proper family education must teach children how to establish safe, unyielding boundaries, even and perhaps especially with their own flesh and blood. Furthermore, this story redefines the concept of legacy. In society, we often view inheritance strictly through the lens of real estate and bank accounts. But true legacy is not the transfer of wealth. It is the transfer of responsibility. Theodore did not leave the immense power of his blind trust to Winifred simply because she was his granddaughter. He transferred the control of the empire to her because she was the only one who proved she possessed the honesty, the logic, and the iron discipline required to protect it. He gave her the estate because she had already built her own foundation without it. When the dust settles on the shattered illusions of the golden child and the enabling mother, we are left with the cold, enduring architecture of the truth. Parenting is not about crafting a perfect image for the world to see. It is about raising individuals who can withstand the brutal audit of reality. Look around your own living room. Look at the faces gathered around your dining table. The roles we assign to one another, the successful one, the quiet one, the disappointment, the savior. Are they based on empirical truth, or are they convenient fictions we maintain because the reality is too difficult to face? The ledgers of our lives are constantly being written, every action and omission adding up over the decades. When the final audit comes and the heavy book is dropped onto the table, what will your numbers say? Will they reveal a foundation built on integrity and resilience, or a fragile house of cards, just waiting for the wind? The answer is already there, hidden in the quiet moments you choose to ignore.